Hello, everyone. Welcome to the session on COVID-19, the fourth industrial revolution, Globalization 4.0, and the Sustainable Development Goals. I am Landry Signé, and from the Thunderbird School of Global Management. As you know, the Thunderbird School of Global Management is the vanguard of global leadership, management, and business education for the fourth industrial revolution. We prepare future-ready leaders, managers, entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs across the world for the private or public sector who advance inclusive and sustainable prosperity. And as you probably also know, we were ranked as the best masters in management in the world by the Wall Street Journal and by the Wall Street Journal and Time Higher Education ranking. And as you also know, the our university, Arizona State University, is ranked number one in terms of U.S. innovation. That is ahead of Stanford or MIT, but also number one for the Sustainable Development Goals. And the leadership that Thunderbird School of Global Management that we have seen at the Thunderbird School of Global Management in the recent years has been driven by our outstanding leader, Dean Kagram, who is our Director General and Dean, and who really brought that vision of the fourth industrial revolution, training the leaders of the fourth industrial revolution. So today, we will be having an in-house conversation with my colleagues, Nicholas Davis. So Nicholas Davis is a professor of practice at the Thunderbird School of Global Management and the managing partner at Swift Partners, a Geneva-based consultancy focusing on helping companies to harness emerging technologies to create sustainable value. So from 2015 to 2019, Nick was the head of society and innovation and a member of the executive committee at the World Economic Forum, where he has co-authored with the executive chairman and founder Klaus Schwab the book Shaping the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Mark Esposito, our other panelist, is a co-founder of Nexus Frontier Tech, and he has held appointment and fellowship at Heart International Business School, Harvard University, Cambridge University, and is now the co-director of the Fourth Industrial Revolution and Globalization 4.0 Center at the Thunderbird. So from 2013 to 2019, he was the co-leader of the Institute's Council for Microeconomics and Competitiveness program at the Michael Porter Institute for Strategy and Competitiveness at Harvard University. And he has authored numerous books, including 2 Amazon's bestsellers. And finally, we have Nima Elmi, our moderator of the day, who is the head of government affairs at the Centre for the Fourth Industrial Revolution at the World Economic Forum. Nima is a public international law and policy development expert focused on international relations, from peace-building initiatives to the governance of emerging technologies. He has previously worked in investment banking at the United Nations, international law firms in London and the Middle East, and was advisor and strategist to senior officials in government in East Africa and the African Union. Of course, he's one of the World Economic Forum Young Global Leader, was named one of the UK Power List as a rising star, and graduated from Harvard, Oxford, King's College, among other. So without taking more time, let me give the floor to Nima, our moderator.
Thank you so much, Lanray. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I know it's an early start, particularly in the US time zones. So we're going to spend about, I'd say, 25, 30 minutes having a little bit of a chat. This is a kind of informal discussion that we're recording and making publicly available with the esteemed colleagues that we have with us here today, and then we'll open the floor for questions and answers. So feel free to use the chat function to jot down questions for Mark, Nick, and Lanray, and the more challenging, the better. So it is a pleasure to join you and the rest of the panel, and undoubtedly, I am looking forward to the very exciting and lively discussion we're about to have. And so with that said, perhaps I can take the liberty of starting with Nick, since you and I were both at the forum for a long time together, and you're obviously an expert in the fourth industrial revolution thought leadership. You were involved really at the kind of genesis of the forum's work, Nick, on the fourth industrial revolution for a few years, and have written extensively on technology governance, including co-authoring a book with Klaus Schwab, the executive chairman. I'd love maybe just to get us kicked off for this conversation, if you can talk us through a little bit about that kind of origin story for the fourth industrial revolution concept. And particularly I'm keen on you kind of telling us a little bit more about your emphasis in your writings around human-centered design and the value of human decision-making in technology, innovation, and use.
Nima, and thanks everyone for joining us. Yeah, look, it's kind of interesting because before 2015, the phrase "the fourth industrial revolution" wasn't used. The dominant reference in that space was Industry 4.0, and Industry 4.0 is a 2011-2012 German concept around the digitization of manufacturing systems and sectors. And really, what Professor Schwab's insight was in the summer of 2015. And he called me into his office to discuss this point because I was head of society and innovation, looking after our social partnerships and also looking after a number of emerging technology areas at the forum. He brought me in and said, Nick, look, I think something's really important that we need to say about technology. Technology's a lot more important than we think of it as. And being more than 40 years younger than my boss, I kind of thought to myself, well, of course, we've just had the second machine age come out. We've had the fourth revolution come out from Luciana Floridi and others. This is a topic that's being talked about a lot. And Klaus's response was, yes, but it's being talked about in the wrong way. We're not putting human experience and connecting that to the economic transformations. We're talking about technology as a seemingly kind of separate or exogenous outside driver that is the domain of geeks and tech entrepreneurs. We need to bring this conversation much closer in to the strategic needs of policymakers, business leaders, and civil society leaders. And that's why he asked me to work with him as head of society and innovation on that project to create the first book, the 2016 book, The Fourth Industrial Revolution, the theme of Davos that year, and then all the subsequent writing and work that's been mentioned so far. But getting to your point about human-centered, that was really a critical difference in the way that the World Economic Forum, and you know this very well as the leader of this governance work and a lot of the center work, is getting people to not just talk about it from a technologically driven, object-oriented perspective, but to shift it much more towards user and community experiences. And I guess the work that I'm particularly interested in on the governance side, so on how you make rules within organizations and in the public spaces, but also with the design of these systems, is thinking through at the early stages of the technology how it might impact communities, engagement, people of varying levels of power, varying abilities to engage with technology, varying generations, etc. And just one small example of that has been very obvious recently with the last couple of days, the brouhaha over Twitter's biased, racist algorithm for cropping photos that you post to Twitter. And if you post a photo, the algorithm overwhelmingly chooses the white face rather than the black face to give you the kind of the little snapshot, the smaller version of that larger image. And a lot of this work in terms of design and thinking from a human-centered manner is the challenge of testing all different uses of those technologies with the question, how will this technology impact our ethics and our values for our stakeholders? And that's just one of many kind of issues that are coming up in terms of bias. But at the moment, the prevailing view is let's build the technology and then test it later to see if it affects people in ways that damage us. And I think the point of the fourth industrial revolution narrative is to say we're at the beginning of that journey now as a society. Let's think first about people and then build systems to those specifications, rather than building the cool widget and then thinking, oh gosh, that was a bit silly. We didn't realize how racist that algorithm is. So we're still in need of shifting our mindset and our perspective towards that insight that Professor Schwab had back in 2015.
Excellent, and actually that's feeds in nicely, and I want to get Lanre and Mark involved in this discussion because Mark, in particular, you have also written extensively about the governance of technology, and in a recent article that you and Lanre co-authored earlier this month, you said that you wrote that the COVID-19 crisis is a historic opportunity to define the future of international cooperation, and the question of how to regulate and use new technologies will not be restricted to one industry or country. I'd love you to say a little bit more about this and drawing on what Nick just commented on about the direction you see this going. And in particular, are we making real progress when it comes to the interface between technology and policy, or is it still a little bit of a Pandora's box that no one really wants to delve into?
Well, Nima, thanks so much for bringing this up, and certainly grateful that you're mentioning that article Landry, myself, and Sanjeev wrote into Project Syndicate and then reposted on Brookings. So the strong conversation around governance is that we are now dealing with global issues that are determined by the fact that this governance is now defining the largest form of value creation. In terms of technology companies today are no longer just technology companies, they are the enabler for value. So like we regulate money, we regulate banks, we regulate drugs, we should also think about regulating technology companies without thinking that regulation must lead to an innovation graveyard. We are far from that. We all come from either business background or a political science background that understands that a private sector and public sector, they need to coexist and they have to support each other. I think the problem that we see with governance is that these organizations are becoming too large. And I think as an economist, my major concern is that they're generating in market inefficiency, in which we're having on one side the platformization of the economy, in which everything has become an intangible aggregator that is determined by a platform. And on the other side, we have in the real economy that is now really struggling. And the worst about that is that the way we currently measure economic performance is still the 1934 GDP that Kuznets brought to Congress. So in 1934, the world had very different needs and priorities than in 2020. So if we're not able to change our measurements, we're going to have the paradoxic reality in which stock exchanges go up. The people on the ground, they don't really have any particular benefit from that. So I think the disproportional value of the digital rents that this technology company are extracting from all of us is at the center of governance. And not to prevent them from operating what they do best, just to allow them to operate in the best of their ability within what Nick said before, in a human-centered perspective. This organization, interestingly though, many of them, they started with a social purpose. We all remember how Facebook was supposed to make us find friends that we got lost throughout time. It was a way for Twitter to say, can we make sure that brevity is the key way for us to communicate important information? We were using a social platform like LinkedIn or others to define network opportunities in which we could find opportunity that we had never thought of, because now the world was becoming a larger representation. So the origins of that was actually quite benevolent. Now they're becoming larger than their ability to even imagine this. And I think they are responsible in defining a set of behavior that is within the human-centric tenets that we need to establish. And I guess that's what we really want to see in terms of governance. We don't want to limit their ability to be innovation powerhouses, but we have to also hold them accountable that their behavior is rapidly changing perceptions, is creating impression on a reality that is changing the public debate. And as somebody sometimes say this, is equally eroding some aspect of democracy. So I think this is where I think the conversation really wants to go. And that's the direction where I think we'll continue to write. I think we're just getting started in our own understanding of governance. And we want to go deeper into this because I think that's where we can have a contribution that is worth it.
I think that's you said kind of resonates really well. And actually it's a nice for a conversation we had earlier in the week, which Lanre moderated. And I want to bring you in here because sticking to the topic of governance, because it's such a huge issue, as co-director of Thunderbird's Fourth Industrial Revolution and Globalization 4.0 initiative, you've been working on the concept of agile governance in the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And I think what I heard from Mark is very much that these tech companies are getting to a place where they're too big to regulate, but also the regulators themselves need to change their processes. I'd love to hear a little bit from you, Lanre, as to why you think global governance is critical now, and share a little bit more about the notional role of agile governance in this context.
So absolutely. So that is a wonderful question, Nima. So perhaps to put a few elements in context, and you have probably read The Great Reset. There are a few trends which are important to highlight there, given COVID-19, for example, a battered economy. So COVID-19 is likely to induce a persistent 80% that will potentially depress wages, raise unemployment, and exacerbate inequality. So that is a very important point. So another point is the inequalities which are weakening the social contract. So definitively reinforcing the trend of stagnant, low-skill wages and rising inequality by fostering automation and digitalization as well. So we have a third factor, which is big but ineffective governments. And here also, we have seen governments, especially in the United States, in Europe, heavily investing, mounting multi-trillion dollars intervention, and we often backed by central banks. However, processes or agility in terms of governance do not necessarily follow. So that's, although before COVID-19, people were complaining about the large tech company, now we even have bigger tech industry. So let's speak about Amazon, Google, Facebook. COVID-19 has really helped fortify empire of big tech as the lockdown created a shift toward e-commerce and teleworking among other factors. To this, we should add also the geopolitical tensions, China-US trade war among other. We had also the Saudi-Russian oil price war, if I can call it like this. So which reinforce the somehow anarchical structure of the world politics. By anarchical, of course, in the sense of international relation, means that we don't have a central government regulating world's affairs, despite the critical role played by the UN. And finally, probably another important point is the fact that COVID-19 is really highlighting the critical importance of stakeholder capitalism versus shareholder capitalism. This was also a theme broadly discussed at Davos this year, when we're still able to travel and to engage in person in major convenings. So these shifts are complex, they are interrelated, they are unpredictable, and they are really making it hard to articulate and to design appropriate social, economic, and political, let's say, public policies responses. So that's why it is really critical to consider agile governance, whether at the local, national, and even international level, in order to really provide an effective response to some of those major challenges. Now, when we speak about agile governance, many people will be thinking about speed. No, but Nima, I think as we discussed about a couple of days ago, agile governance is adaptive, human-centered, inclusive, and sustainable policy making, which acknowledges that policy development is an increasingly multi-stakeholder effort and is the continual readiness to navigate change by proactively or reactively embracing that change, learning from it as well. So that's the conception that you brought in the publication, in the founding publication about it. So it really involves flexibility, responsiveness, this human-centric, data-driven, result-oriented, while remaining fair, transparent, and accountable. So those are extremely important aspects of agile governance. And of course, we have multiple tools for agile governance, whether we speak about regulatory sandboxes, which allow to test innovations or new technologies before being generalized, or design thinking, crowdsourcing, public-private dialogues, among others. So I'll be happy to further expand, but I think I'll stop here for now.
It's nice to see. I mean, it's clear that you're very passionate about the topic. And actually, I want to bring in Nick, who, Nick, you know, obviously, for the audience, you and I have worked extensively on the concept of agile governance. But in particular, I want to thread together the responses from Mark and Lanre about technology governance more generally, and your initial comments to get your thoughts on what role should ethics play in tech today. And in particular, you know, let's be frank here, is it just a fluffy talking point that doesn't have teeth, or can it be a little bit more meaningful? Where do you see this going?
Yeah, thanks, Nima. Look, it's a great question, because it's a real pity that the CEOs that I work with and many of the policymakers, they do view ethics as either very fluffy, indistinct, kind of almost a weasel word that doesn't mean much. It's related to a long list of values that don't actually affect behavior. Or if you're a senior business leader, you think of it immediately as reputational risk. And it's not strategic or value driven. But ethics is about how we choose to guide our behavior. It's about how we live, what we think of as good and bad. It's some of the most practical aspects of our life are related to our own personal ethics. And we're faced with ethical decisions, whichever organization we're in every single day, whether we realize it or not. So I guess my big push on governance in relation to ethics is for a better distinction between what we mean when there's an ethical challenge related to technology. And I'm working on a paper with my colleague, Tom Philback, who you know very well. In fact, I think all three of you know Tom fairly well. And Tom and I, given that Tom's the philosopher, I'm the lawyer, we're working on this that essentially lays out 4 different, very distinct ethical challenges, or with the hope that will support business leaders and policymakers about how to regulate or write new laws in different ways. So maybe I'll just take 2 minutes to give you the 4 categories, if that's okay, and hopefully when we can drive some bigger discussion on this at a future day. So ethical challenge number 1 is actually not an ethical challenge at all. It's a category of laws and duties. If someone says to you, oh, look at that company acted unethically by not reporting the cybersecurity breach, the ransomware that was in their system, or they didn't act ethically because they misused their customer data. That's not a question of ethics. That's a question of law. Every country has now adopted privacy laws, essentially. Cybersecurity laws, very strong in every major market. So you don't get, there's lots of laws that relate to human rights, that relate to the way we treat labor force. You don't get to talk about ethics when there's a written law. Law supersedes your set of corporate values or corporate policies. There's a second category here that's very interesting. And by the way, if you see you're in group 1, you need to invest in compliance, or you need to work to make collaborative policy making. The answer is not to pretend that it doesn't exist. The second category is there are a whole load of genuine dilemmas in ethics in technology. And particularly we've seen these recently with how who tech companies choose to work with. So the classic case here for me is Project Maven, with Google's decision not to renew its contract with the US military to use its machine learning computer vision services to help weapons targeting systems. Now, there's nothing illegal if you're a properly vetted US company. There's nothing illegal about working with the US military. But it went against the values and principles of a number of Google's employees and some of its other stakeholders and investors. This kind of dilemma is a tricky problem because there's no winning answer. Everyone's going to be upset no matter what you choose. But you don't need to go to your legal team to talk about this issue. You need to actually engage with your stakeholders and understand your customers and their values, and you need to be prepared to lose some support when you make the decision. The third category I already brought up, which is what I call type 3. It's like scope 3 emissions in sustainability, where it's the indirect downstream or upstream emissions that you can't directly control. And that's here is where you don't do a good enough job at product design, and there's externalities that escape. Or someone takes your piece of technology and uses it in ways that you didn't intend. And so type 3 problems are tricky because they require much more foresight and design investment than people are used to at the moment. And the reason why new technologies require that much more design is because they are so much more scalable and so much more powerful than previous consumer technologies we've seen. And type 4 ethical challenges are the ones that only appear when everyone is using that technology. So it's the kind of the Uberization of the economy, or the gig economy. You don't realize that something on a small scale, it improves everyone's lives. It lowers the cost. It does do some disruption in the industry, but it doesn't necessarily change an entire labor market for the worse until that's the dominant model which everyone picks up. And then you realize that our current social security systems, our current labor laws, our current economic ways of transferring benefits don't work if everyone's a gig economy worker. And so for me, those 4 different types, the ethics, the law that's pretending to be ethics, but it's really law, type 1, the genuine ethical dilemmas, where it's a choice, a legal choice, but you have to choose what your stakeholders align to. The third, which is really around externalities or bias and design. And the fourth, which is the system level effects, like Facebook's effect on democracy that Mark brought up earlier. They all require different strategies, different coalitions, different ways of engaging. And we have to untangle a lot of these problem statements and these governance challenges to be able to have the public conversation and put our resources to solve that particular issue. Otherwise, we're going to be completely fragmented, torn apart, and there's going to be too much of a wasted time just trying to agree on the right language to work together. And so I hope with this community that when that piece is getting published very soon, that we'll have a broader conversation about whether frameworks like that one are useful for engaging on the question of ethics and governance in technology.
You have said a lot of really interesting things to unpack. And so now that we've kind of ventured down this road, let's continue on. And I'll turn to you, Mark, about some of the, when we talk about tech, we talk a lot about the good and the bad, and everybody kind of shies away from the ugly. So let's touch a little bit on that. And I think that's where Nick was kind of pushing towards. Mark, COVID-19 has enabled governments to use technologies in a number of ways, including the implementation of track and tracing systems, which requires access to a lot of personal information of citizens. Has this opened a Pandora's box about the increasing and overuse of surveillance technology? Are we moving closer to that Orwellian world that Nick was hinting at in terms of the potential for technology to step into that ugly part of human existence?
Yeah. So, Nima, thanks again for this question. And I really appreciate where the conversation is going and how you're shaping the fil rouge for us to really build on what we are sensing, researching, writing about this, and eventually teaching as well in class. So I think there is a number of issues that I feel comfortable sharing. Before the pandemic, we were quite clear that the nation state as a concept was becoming weaker in favor of the functional geography that we're demonstrating that most of economic value is no longer concentrated in federal structures, is really in regional. The reason of functional geography, like Parkway calls it, is the fact that we're using geography for a purpose. And one of the things I always proud myself as a globalist is that for the first time in history, we really are investing much more in infrastructure than in defense. So we really have an understanding that it's in what we share that creates shared accountability and, of course, opportunity, trade, FDI, peace. It's not what we don't share. On the contrary, countries that don't have much in common, they also have less reason to keep it quiet. I guess what I somehow suffer from the COVID-19 from a macroeconomic perspective, and of course technology has been the unintended consequence of this, is that we have empowered nation state again to supersede on the regional geographies. We shut down borders. We decided that suddenly it was a state of emergency. I'm not criticizing what is a crisis management approach. I am much more critical of whether this is becoming a permanent state of crisis. There have been things happening in the end of the 40s, 50s in Israel that were not removed until the beginning of the millennium. So somehow it's very easy to shut down a system. It's not that easy to make it open again, because if you think about it, there is unilateralism in actually shutting down a system, but there is multilateralism in making it work again. And I'm very concerned about what Nick was saying before, that if we're not readjusting the ethical conversation, technology will be our greatest inequalizer. It will be the driver of fragmentation and inequality that we were fearing for so long. So I think the question that you're bringing up is, I'm afraid that with the nation state superseding some of our decisions these days, technology has become the perfect ally, in which suddenly through technology you have access to that conversation. But it doesn't solve the conversation we were having before about governance of technology, because governments don't have the capacity to build the technology themselves. They have to acquire it. We're not necessarily reconciling the ethical dimension about, is this technology supposed to indirectly support commercial benefits, and the shareholder conversation that Landry was making before. How do we make sure that it's a stakeholder conversation, not shareholder? It's quite hard because commercial ventures are designed to maximize shareholder value. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just what they are born to do. But their purpose right now is no longer becoming a shareholder conversation with the value proposition in the market. It's that the market is made by so many different dimensions that, as Nick was saying before, disentangling this is becoming so difficult these days. So I would say that the ugly side of technology is when technology is utilized to reinforce agendas that are determined by some form of coercion, not when technology is actually used to create some form of consonant society in which we can unify some of these interests, where we can actually use the power of technology to create foresight on climate, for example. How underrated and underplayed this conversation is. I wish, as you know, I have interest in the artificial intelligence industry because I co-founded an AI company. I wish that some of our clients' requests were about using climate change and AI within the same sentence. I wish we could use this to actually create much more financial inclusion. So that rather than talking about fintech or techfin, we're talking about how do we bring millions of people on board by giving them the opportunity of a financial literacy, to give them access to the credit history that is required for them to get into a mindset of asset saving, eventually reinstatement into a society that requires financial flows. So I think these are some of the challenges that I see. That technology can really be used as a negative, I would say a negative driver for the wrong conversation. And again, it is what we make of it. Technology is neutral. It's an object. There's nothing that is actually live in it. But it's our mismanagement of this that I think is becoming problematic. That's why the conversation on agile governance, ethical, it's equally related to this is why we need this to be somehow a priority for governments, because otherwise we're going to see a shortcut mindset to be justified by the efficiency rush that the technology so nicely pleases. So.
Yeah, I see Nick and Lanre are ready to jump in, and actually, I think the audience are also active in the chat. Anna flagged in the audience that she views technology as a catalyst of all the problems that we have, but avoid addressing. So I'd love to get Nick and Lanre in on this before we shift gears slightly, just to share your thoughts. And in particular, Nick, I would love you to discuss the role of business in this, and you too, Lanre, in your responses, particularly around kind of the stakeholder versus shareholder capitalism that we have discussed earlier this year in Davos. Maybe, Nick, you jump in first, and then Lanre.
Sure. One thing that Mark and I occasionally disagree on that I want to kind of highlight as something that I'm really passionate about is this narrative around technology as being a tool or being neutral. And it's true that humans have more power over technology than we realize. We talk about it as if it's this otherworldly thing that comes to us from this strange sector or these strange alien-like, young entrepreneurs wearing hoodies. But it's not that at all. Like, it's the collective design, technological research. It's mostly publicly funded ultimately, and it really is under a lot more control than we think. The challenge is that I think sometimes when we reassert that fact, we forget that technologies become infrastructure relatively quickly, and infrastructure can be biased. Infrastructure embeds our human frailties in ways that have really negative impacts on people's lives. And so I just wanted to kind of add to Mark's empowering call there, which is completely correct, to say we need to understand that we can take control, and we should take control early in this process. But I want to add to that and say, if we get it wrong, we could end up with the example of the Parkway bridges in New York. And this is a famous example of technology being exclusionary, because Robert Moses, who was the master planner of New York in the first quarter of the 20th century, literally designed the freeway, parkway, and building systems at the bottom edge of New York. He specifically designed the bridges that crossed over the parkways so that they were too low for the public buses to go under. So the public buses would not be able to access the Long Island beaches that middle-class white New Yorkers were using for recreation, deliberately, because the bus system was used by poor immigrants and people of color in New York. And he was quite open about his attitudes towards the relative mobility and the rights of people in New York at the time. And that was an infrastructure decision that excluded for 30, 40 years low-cost access to beaches in the East Coast of the United States. So I just want us to remember stories like that when we think that a biased Twitter algorithm, it's not such a big deal. Actually, there are people in jail today because they are people of color, and the algorithm was designed in ways prejudiced against them and allowed people with exactly the same conditions and risk factor to get out on bail. And if we allow these systems to become infrastructure over time, we build layers on top of them, just like we build buildings around parkways or we build bus networks that go across and under bridges. We're in danger of creating a fourth industrial revolution that has a very different flavor to the one that we kind of think and imagine in terms of a human-centered, inclusive piece. And I guess I want to pass over, I'll always give Mark the right of reply. I know that he knows that I'm not disagreeing with him, but rather adding that facet to
Absolutely.
the point. But I want to pass it over to Henry, because for me, one of the critically important aspects in that collaborative design issue is the role of business. Because if businesses say, that's not my role is not to worry about social impact or bias. That's the role of the lawmakers, the policymakers, the civil society organizations, the pressure groups. If that's the approach, I guarantee the values that drive profit and a central group of people who will generate the most amount of money, that will be the tech infrastructure of the next generation, rather than this human-centered, let's look at the margins, let's look at people with less voice and less focus. And for me, that's actually one of the most important aspects of Thunderbird's center, is to look at management and leadership roles that cast the private sector as a profitable, engaging stakeholder space, which is attending to those edges of that distribution, not just the kind of the high profit center. So I'll hand over to Landry, because he's the director of the center, and this is along with Mark, his co-director. This is their baby. So I'll let Landry talk about stakeholder capitalism and why that matters. And thanks, Nima.
Nima and Nick, Mark, wonderful conversation. I like that we are part of the same team, but we have different perspectives. So perhaps before getting to the conversation, let me say a few words about the fourth industrial revolution and globalization 4.0 center that we are all leading. Mark, Nick, and we are the top leaders of the 4.0 center.
Landry, your sound is not coming through properly.
Yeah, I was just about to interrupt. Say we can't hear you. Maybe play around with that a little bit and see.
Yes, is it better now?
Much better.
Yes.
Wonderful. So I was saying that I was very excited to see the conversation between colleagues, Mark, Nick. So we are all leading the fourth industrial revolution and globalization 4.0 center at Thunderbird. And as a matter of fact, the center serves a cross-sectoral hub that leverage our strength of Thunderbird worldwide. We are present in, our alumni are present in over 145 countries. And to really help maximizing the benefit of the fourth industrial revolution while minimizing the risk and achieving local, national, or continental prosperity. And for that, we have three core activities. One is to provide cutting-edge and evidence-based insight on the fourth industrial revolution, globalization 4.0, that advance business, policy, society for shared prosperity. So a second one is awareness on the fourth industrial revolution and its leaders, so to educate and engage. And the third one is to bringing the fourth industrial revolution, disruptive innovation and agile governance to organizations and society. So not just thinking like think tank, but also doing like do tank. So those are some of the aspects that are critical. And of course, in this conversation, one point that I want to highlight is emerging economies and Africa.
I'm just about to go there.
Yes, because you almost intrinsically, most of the innovation on the in Africa, for example, are human-centric innovation. The goal is to really respond to basic need or shortcomings of states among other. Whether we speak about, again, I don't like to bring it that much because it's in all the conversation. Whether we speak about M-Pesa, which has really allowed for the Unbank to finally have the ability to make transactions, or even during the confinement, for example, to protect. As you know, that one of the transmission of COVID-19 was through exchange or physical exchange. Now, digitally, people were able to engage. But whether we also speak about innovation, and we mentioned them a few days ago, such as the cardiopad, or Gifted Mom, which are a tablet which allow intervention, cardiac interventions, for example, between cardiologists, which may be in city centers, and patients which are in rural areas, or Gifted Mom, which allow to help improving maternal health or newborn health. So in agriculture, we have also many of such innovation. So yes, when we speak about those critical questions, and Nima, I also want you to share a little bit your perspective on it, because you have just written an incredibly insightful piece on the fourth industrial revolution in emerging economies. So it is really important to understand that, yes, we have some critical ethical issues here in the advanced economies, but not just in advanced economies. Cyber and security, for example, in the continent, we have seen Facebook, which has closed numerous accounts of presumed or reported Russian intervention on the continent, including to influence the result of elections. So, yes, ethical questions are critical. On the other hand, that's one of the reasons why agile governance is also important, because it allows to bring different stakeholders to the table, around the table, and to engage. They can express their concern. We can test some of the innovation before they are implemented. So, which means that the policy making sphere is not anymore the reserved domain of policy leaders, but we have more direct ways for society, for business to be engaged. And business leaders also cannot anymore do anything, because it's the likelihood of being reported and for it to have an impact on your profits will also be high. So I will explain later, but Nima, please share your perspective as well. Your article was so incredible that I think everyone will deserve to know a little bit more about it.
Well, thank you, Lanre. You've touched on a number of different things, and helpfully you've also answered some of the questions in the chat around the need for business to be driven by a triple bottom line. I think the general feedback that I'm getting from all three of you is that there needs to be a greater focus on responsible innovation, and for that to happen, we need to have a greater emphasis on ethics and human-centered design from the outset, and hold both governments and businesses accountable. I think we align on the what. I think the challenge has always been the how. And I think that's where we still have a lot more discussion to be had in thinking about the how, because as Nick mentioned, the gig economy has a huge impact on how we think about social benefits, how we think about taxation, how we think about protecting workers. And the impact on these technologies, on the way our societies are structured as social systems. And so this conversation could go on for several hours, and I think we'd still have enough exciting things to cover. I'm mindful that we have about 5 minutes. I'd like us to wrap up a little bit early. And just to your point, Lanre, about emerging technologies, I think if you Google my name, you'll find the article that Lanre is referencing on the World Economic Forum's agenda website, which talks through the fourth trends coming out of emerging economies when it comes to the fourth industrial revolution. And I encourage you all to visit there. But I agree with you, Nick, about the real ugly part of technology being when the real world biases spill online, and we don't have sensible ways to deal with that. And I like you think, this conversation around unintended consequences of technology is a cop-out. I think we have to say more and call more organizations, particularly at the forefront of technology innovation, out for the fact that they know some of the consequences and choose to sweep them under the carpet. And I think most people would have seen A Social Dilemma on Netflix. If you haven't, I think this is a great way to at least amongst the general public about the manipulative nature of some of the social platforms, and how this is actually thought through and incentivized, and isn't just a net neutral attitude to technologies at all. Having said all of that, I want to end on a positive note. And so I'd love for the three of you just to give me a minute, and literally a minute. I'm going to be very swift with my timekeeping, about your thoughts on what is the most interesting research or aspiration about the fourth industrial revolution today. What is the good that you're really excited about when we talk about technology? And maybe we'll kick off with you, Nick.
Excellent question. So I think the most and exciting work is the sociological work that's going on in disadvantaged communities and how they experience technology. So we have for many years driven technology top down out of technology centers. We haven't given much academic focus or innovation funding to frugal innovation. And I'm really excited about the work that Laundry and others are doing, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. But I'm also excited about the sociologists who are working with disadvantaged communities in the US, in France, in Australia, to understand how at the community level technology can be empowering and redesigned to improve people's lives, so that we don't have to make this choice between I accept a racist, aggressive algorithm and platform that is, mostly hate-filled or whatever, just because that's the way everyone else in my network communicates, right? That should not be a trade-off that we need to make, and yet it's been the dominant discussion around even market entry and competition at the moment. Unless you make this concession to this tech company, they're going to leave Europe, for example, is a common concern. So I'm excited about shifting the focus on innovation and research to community-led activities, and to focus on peoples whose voices hasn't been traditionally dominant in the design of technology or in its funding.
Excellent. Over to you, Lanre.
Thank you very much, Nima. So I think what is really critical here, so the fourth industrial revolution represents a tremendous opportunity for the world in general, but for developing economies and Africa in particular, and for Africa, for example, to capitalize on the fourth industrial revolution. Is extremely important to achieve universal access to internet. So that is one critical element, but beyond the access, we also have the quality, the effectiveness, the use of those to really contribute to industrialization, to societal transformation, among other. And to conclude also, I want to also highlight, when we speak about fourth industrial revolution, many people will connect it to industrialization exclusively or to manufacturing among other. But as Nick also pointed out earlier, we have to connect it with its broader scope, with impact in society, on the economies, on culture, among others.
Excellent. Last but not least, Mark, what are your thoughts?
So, Nima, thanks again. This is actually a great question to finish, right? Because it also changes our mood a lot in thinking about the prospect of the future. I personally think, of course, I subscribe to what Nick and Landry aspires to for the fourth industrial revolution. In my case, just to add a different dimension, I wish we are going to be able to change the measurements of what defines value and performance in the world. The 20th century was by design discriminatory. It was designed by creating a class A and class B. I remember growing up with the idea there's a first, second, and third world. I see the opportunity we have in the fourth industrial revolution is to really create that sense of convergence that I think we deserve to have. I love to see the end of medieval structure being actually somehow fracture after the pressure of the new value structure we're going to have. I think that for once we're going to be able to integrate sustainability as part of the equation, rather than thinking like it happened in the 60s that the environment was a problem, and therefore it was okay, right, to make it a negative externality. So to summarize this, I see the fourth solution as a way to change the way we speak, we think about the creation of value. For me, it's a language that we're learning, and language creates semantics and meaning. And I think it's an entirely different way of thinking about what it is like. And to finish on that, right, I remember when I saw the original video that launched the fourth solution at the forum in 2016. And it mainly said it changes our relationship to the planet, it changes our relationship to life, and it changes our relationship to mainly to the nature of work. And so that's the sociological side, there is the governance side, but there's also the ability for us to rediscover human-centric design that I think for too long we have industrialized too much. So that's what I like to think as the aspiration towards the fourth IR.
I think that's a beautiful place to kind of wind down this conversation. And if I add my kind of final thoughts to this, I'm really excited about the fact that this is now at least out in the open, right? Like if you are lost in the dark, switch on the light. And at least now we're all talking about the not so nice parts, the ugly parts of technology, whilst also advocating for the good and acknowledging that we need to address the bad. And I think only through this type of frank dialogue where you're engaged, whether through social media platforms or outside, can we at least get to a place where we could have a little bit more good governance and responsible innovation as more than just the semantics that we put in brochures and talk about in sessions, and actually really live as our truth. And so with that said, thank you all to the 150 plus participants. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. I've learned a lot. I found this super fascinating, and I look forward to continuing this going forward. Have a lovely day.